Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Mr. Mad Hatter, and this is the Toasty Time podcast. This is going to be our initial episode. We're going to be doing a somewhat of an in-depth review into the 2022 film that just came out for The Batman, starring Robert Pattinson, which essentially takes place in an earlier iteration of Gotham, where you find ourselves following a Bruce Wayne that's pretty recent into his journey. He doesn't necessarily quite have an idea of what it is to be Batman as of yet. He's returning to Gotham, and he's essentially looking to establish what his legacy is, or what the Wayne family legacy is going to be at this point. He's been away from Gotham for some time, and in the time that he's returned, it's taken a series of turns that have ultimately found Gotham in a heavy wave of corruption. There's mob ties and gang bosses taking over. Drugs are running rampant through the cities. There's corruption in the politicians, the government branches, the police forces, and pretty much everyone who holds any form of governing body within the city of Gotham has some form of underhanded corruptness going on. And Bruce, at this point in time, 2 years returned into the city, is Batman, and is ultimately trying to find out, one, if being Batman is the right thing he should be doing, and if it's the best thing that can be serving the community that he now finds himself being a part of. Now, initially, when we open up the film, Batman is patrolling through the city. He's scouring the criminals that are doing various means to try to keep a foothold on the community, to just show that there's someone looking out for the area. There's someone who cares enough and who is invested enough in what's going on to ensure that, the city doesn't fall completely to shit, which it ultimately has at this point in time. Now, Bruce finds himself dealing with someone who he hasn't quite had to have an exchange with up until this point. It's implied within the early iteration of the film that he's had some exchanges with some of the villains that we know Batman to be familiar with, but he isn't necessarily the full Dark Knight as of yet. He's still somewhat establishing what that means and how he can best, apply that to assist the community. So when we open up the film, he is being introduced to the antagonist, who's going to be, the main villain of this film, the Riddler. Now, the Riddler is played by Paul Dano. He's an actor who's been in a slew of other films and franchises. He does a lot of good quality work. And in this, I think he does a really impressive job with his version of what the Riddler is. The last Riddler that we got within a live action format was the Jim Carrey version from the Batman film that came out in 1995, Batman Forever, actually. And in it, we get a very comedic, very extensive and affluent, very to the top character of Edward Nygma. And his version of Edward Nygma is someone who, similar to the Paul Dano version, is very existential. He's very much removed from society. He's a Gotham resident and a native, so he's very much within the culture of what's going on and invested in why the city has gone so poorly. But he also seems to have a series of vendettas against the higher ups of Gotham, and seems to, in a sense, blame them for not just his personal plight, but the plight of the city and ultimately everything that's befallen himself and all the less fortunate in Gotham. So, in the midst of that, he is going on a murder spree, and we begin to see him leaving a series of clues behind for Batman to find, because we find later in the film that he actually is under the impression that Batman is there to assist him, that Batman is ultimately in support of what he's doing, that he sees himself as an ally with this person, another social exile who doesn't necessarily fit within the zeitgeist of what society has become, and is ultimately looking for a place to fit in this world, a place to fit within the Gotham that we have now, that the Riddler ultimately holds the responsibility of these people that he's now punishing. So he begins to leave a series of clues behind that Batman specifically is meant to follow, trying to help him get to an end goal of explaining one, why he's doing what he's doing, and ultimately to bring Batman into the fold with what he's doing, help him realize that his way, his direction is the right way, and that they actually share a great deal of similarities with what's put them in position to end up at this spot. So the film steps off from that point, and we gradually get these pockets that we step inside the mind of Bruce Wayne. A lot of internal narration just about his view of what Gotham looks like at this current juncture, what he's doing, and if he feels like it's actually providing some form of positive impact for the community. And ultimately, can he fix these things? Because I feel like that's a really good thing that we get a good look at in this franchise is, or not this franchise, excuse me, in this first step of the franchise is Batman good? Not even necessarily good. Is Batman doing good? Is the best way to save Gotham City from itself, to save the people of this community from themselves, is to brutalize criminals and just ultimately sow fear. Because that's what we get with the initial Bruce Wayne that we start off with, is him sowing a lot of fear. Batman, as far as what the symbol is at this point, is just fear. He's not really hope. He's not really perseverance. You know, any of the ideals that we ultimately get to fully realize Batman of, we don't get that with this one. This is very much early vantage point Batman. And I really appreciate that for that reason. I think that you get an interesting dynamic, somewhat like you find when you get Spider-Man iterations, where you don't necessarily get the fully realized version of them, but you know where they're going, and you're somewhat along for the ride of them packing together how they're going to create this person. Because it seems very clear that Bruce knows that Batman is a necessity at this point in time. The city's really gotten beside itself, and you need someone with a little bit more of a driving hand and more of a deterrent than what the police force can provide at this point in time. So he knows he needs to be there, but what exactly he needs to be and who he needs to be and how he needs to help seem to be things that he's still piecing together. The Batman that we get doesn't really necessarily have a Bruce Wayne persona formulated as of yet. He almost looks at the idea of Bruce Wayne and the idea of ultimately what Bruce Wayne would be doing and how he'd be spending his time, you know, moving and shaking and rubbing elbows with all of the people that would be of note in Gotham that, you know, Bruce Wayne would be in communication with. It feels like a waste of his time. This Bruce Wayne very much feels dejected from regular society. Obviously, some of that overlay being from the murder of his parents at a young age. All of the Batman are generally somewhat dejected. They're not really incorporated within regular society because they don't feel very akin to it. The extensions that you find that a Bruce Wayne we usually have within the film or the cartoon adaptations are his extensional relationships around him. The Alfreds, the Robins, the Jim Gordons, the Selena Kyle, Catwomans. It's always his relationships that are more so kind of like his extensive feelers to the world, because after so much internal and external trauma, he's not really that person that cares to be immersed in the world. And you kind of get that dialed up to 11 in this film. The Robert Pattinson that we get playing Bruce very much just doesn't seem like he cares to engage in the things that the Wayne dichotomy would be about. He's just focused on the case, the job, the structure of saving the city, and how that can be done. And because of that, it brings an initial grievance that I have with the film. I ultimately felt that this was not an oversight, but kind of a transparent look at the character. Bruce doesn't seem to understand, because he's so encompassed in I suppose the more immediate things of politicians, judges, mayors, people of note in the city being captured, kidnapped, and killed by the Riddler, he doesn't really see that he can be doing more good than just the minimal good. Obviously, he feels that he's trying to make some form of progress by cleaning up the crime off the streets, but he doesn't seem to realize that that can be affected in more ways than just the cape and, the beating the shit out of people in the streets. That the philanthropist that Bruce Wayne is, the influence that he carries within the Gotham community, generally speaking, not this version yet, can also be affecting a lot of good. There are foundations that he ultimately finds out, and nonprofits that were getting support from Wayne because the Wayne family had always been very big philanthropists within the community. They were the family that were known the most for giving back. He doesn't do those things. And he doesn't seem to realize that ultimately those things, in addition to the Batman icon of saving the city at night, are the two halves to the whole that ultimately can do the most good for Gotham. And this Bruce Wayne still feels like he's trying to piece that together and ultimately get to a place where he can understand, the fear isn't just enough. And fear is really what we're stepping off with. Is I'm pushing with fear. I will scare them into obeying the law. I will scare them into operating within the correct parameters of justice, and I will ultimately make them too afraid to step out, which is a fine as an initial point, but fear only offers so much in role of a symbol. And by the time we reach the climax of the film, I think that this Batman does a really good job coming to terms with the fact of this is what I need to be going forward to do the most good as a whole, not just the most good as Batman. Now, with now as we reach into the secondary part of the film, we start to unpack what the Riddler has left behind for the Batman ultimately to uncover, which is his grand ploy that he wants to unmask Gotham, unmask the perpetrators of Gotham who have ultimately done wrong its well to do citizens. So the way he does that is he leads Batman on a pathway with a mission that the ultimate goal is to make the rat come out. The rat being the informant that we find ultimately came forward and helped about the drug bust that put the original crime boss, who was played by Mr. John Turturro, as a Mr. Carmine Falcone, away in prison, and ultimately took him off the streets, took his drug crusades off the streets, and allowed for Gotham to make its first substantial bust within, at that point in time, a very considerably drugs problem that was sweeping across the community, and allowed the citizens to feel that the community was taking a step in the right direction. Now, what we come to find out is that the entirety of that drug bust was a facade. And not only did they not actually take any real drugs off the streets, they essentially allowed for the crime boss himself to be able to operate without persecution from the law, to put further members of law enforcement in his pocket, and essentially just allow him to do his job easier with less persecution from anyone involved. And the ultimate reason why the Riddler, who is a criminal himself, wants this person who ratted on this organization to come forward is to bring about the light of the real conspiracy that we find is the grand stinger of the movie, that Bruce Wayne's father, Thomas Wayne, who in this version of Gotham was a politician who was at the point of his life before his murder on his way to becoming mayor of Gotham, and with his wife, Martha, was on her way to becoming not only pillars for the community, but essentially the driving force for what was going to shape Gotham moving forward into the future. And Ultimately, because of this and a series of other things, he was murdered. And we find that the reasoning that led into his murder was because a reporter found some unsavory details well, unsavory information ultimately about the Wayne and the Arkham origins. So essentially, Martha Wayne, who was originally Martha Arkham, Bruce's mother, when she was a child, her family, their infrastructure, and ultimately their reach around Gotham came from her family was the ones that created the Arkham Asylum, and essentially that was a early iteration of a facility dedicated to mental health correction and improvement within the city of Gotham for those who are struggling with health issues. And in the later version of Gotham, in the later history of Gotham, rather, it becomes a housing place for all of the more aggro criminals within the Gotham area that aren't exactly equipped to remain within the prison system, your Jokers, your Riddlers, etc., etc. So essentially, when Martha was a child, she struggled with some mental health issues of her own, and her family being already established with this facility, and it was already equipped to deal with helping and assisting those who struggle with mental health issues. They put her there. Now, it wasn't exactly something that, a well-to-do and prominent family wanted to document it across the city, so they did what they would, a family with money is going to do. They paid to try to hush it up and keep things quiet. And then later in life, when the time came that Thomas Wayne was looking for a wife and a person to, ultimately expand his empire and, supplant himself as a mover and shaker within Gotham on his rise, he found Martha and the family set up a match for them to come together. But obviously, with someone like Thomas Wayne, who had a future that was destined for the public eye, he couldn't have something as unsavory come out as his wife was in a mental facility, so they closed it up. Now, later, years on, when Bruce is just a small child and Thomas Wayne is in the apex of what seems like is going to be a grand slam victory for becoming mayor, the story breaks. Reporter finds out what happens with the history with Mrs. Wayne and ultimately plans to publish a story that the Waynes and corruption and they've hid their dirty origins to try to put themselves in a position of power to take over the community. And Thomas Wayne at the time, panicking as someone in that position does, he comes and reaches out to a friend who we find out it was actually Mr. Falcone, the established gangster who's currently running things in the Gotham that Bruce is currently trying to save as Batman. And apparently, when Thomas reaches out to him, he says that he has to find some way to hush this reporter. He's so close to becoming mayor, really being able to make some change within this community, and he has to find a way to stop this. So what he does is he reaches out to him and says, "Is there something you can do? I need you to." He initially says, "I need you to just scare him." Do something to deter this man from putting out this information, and hopefully this can save my campaign. And Falcone, who's an interesting character. At the time, obviously he agrees because we find out they have a relationship. They're actually close friends. But it's led to believe later on when you're getting this discussion and this is found out and Bruce goes to confront Falcone face to face at his club to explain this happening, that this was motivated by a couple of different things. Up until this point, Thomas Wayne did not have any dirt on his hands, and though he was had an affiliation with someone who was in the criminal zeitgeist, he himself was not dirty. He legitimately was doing nothing but trying to make a prominent stance to improve Gotham. But because up until this point he had not been dirty, he had also not had any opportunity for anyone to have any dirt on him. And Falcone is someone who is an opportunist person. He's not going to pass up this moment to get a chance to say, "You owe me one when I need some shit. When the time comes later on, I will cash this chip." So he reaches out to the reporter and attempts to scare him. And Falcone, when he's explaining this to Bruce later, he says, "I did all I could. I tried to tell this man, this can't come out. Your father had a future. He was going to save this city, but he didn't listen. And when he didn't listen, there really wasn't much left that I could do but silence this man. And we find out that Falcone killed him. Now, this is very ground shattering for a lot of reasons. It's a big stinger, first and foremost, because you get this revealing light that this person, especially the Bruce Batman, who up until that point was his hero, this person that he established his entire ideology behind, this person who he put on a cape and was willing to take to the streets in the night and fuck up citizens to try to protect his legacy because he felt this is what he needed to do to save this city, was essentially an accessory to a murder, an accessory to crime. This person that was his hero, that he had established his entire form of how he looked at his life, was in the wrong, like the same people that he was persecuting on a nightly basis. And it forces him to reassess what he's doing and if it's right to begin with. And it leads to the climax where he's forced to really take a hard look at himself and the city and what it needs and confirm if it's something he can provide. So by the time you've reached the climax of the film, you've really taken a journey with this Bruce Wayne Batman hybrid where you've had a character who's essentially had the question of his values for what exactly he's doing and how he's trying to better things flipped on its head in a sense. And you've had him get a different perspective on what exactly it is he needs to be doing to try to improve his surroundings. So you get to the ending, which through a series of events, the Riddler orchestrates where he gets captured purposely so by Batman and by the police force at one point and allows himself to be taken into custody. Now, this is something that he does ultimately to get a different vantage point on his ultimate grand scheme that he's planning to wrap up his series of exploits with. He has set a series of vans across different points of the dam structure within Gotham that are holding in the river, in the sea apparently, and sets them to explode. And in the midst of him getting captured by Batman, he essentially gets what he has ultimately wanted at the end of this circumstance. Is he wanted to have a face-to-face conversation with Batman to ultimately get him to see and confirm what he felt was that we have been in this entire thing together. The series of events that have been going on through the stint that I've been terrorizing the city, the onslaught on the government, the murdering of the politicians and the mayor and the police force has been to get you and me here so we can speak, to get you to understand that I did this because I am the disenfranchised. I was wronged. Your father, that he is a bit difficult to confirm if he knows or does not know is Bruce Wayne. He has this point within the conversation where he's talking about how we almost got them all because he truly believes himself and Batman have been doing this series of things together. And by all, he means all of the influential people within Gotham that he set out to murder, the end of which being Bruce Wayne. Now, he attempts to murder Bruce Wayne, and this fails because Bruce is not there at the time. And through a series of events where we find ourselves back at the conversation, he's essentially explained to them, we didn't get Bruce, that Bruce Wayne. Now, when he's saying this, he puts a lot of inflection on Bruce's name as he's staring at him, almost looking into his soul to say, I know it's you behind that mask, and I know I didn't get you. But at the same time, there have been, I've heard, and also I've felt different inflections that you can take that he was essentially just saying Bruce Wayne because he was so passionate that that was the last piece of the puzzle that he didn't get to complete. Now, how you choose to slice that, you can go either way. I personally went with the ideology that he understood that Batman was Bruce and he just put two and two together, but didn't care to put that out into the public at that point in time. So he says that we did not get Bruce. And his justification for all of these crimes that he's done over this time is that your father wronged me. We go back, and the grand stinger that we uncover is that Thomas Wayne, in comparison, or excuse me, not comparison, in combination and conjecture with his plan to become mayor, set up this fund of $1 billion that essentially he combined to do all of these great projects, orphanages for the community, better housing, uh, land development projects, just a bunch of things that would have ensured that Gotham would have continued on, would have continued to generate income, would have continued to generate jobs, that Gotham would have been profitable under his jurisdiction, which is great. But unfortunately, he ends up getting killed. And the event that essentially kicks off the onslaught that turns Gotham into essentially a mass power grab between various politicians, dirty cops, and crime bosses is this mass amount of money gets left behind that was set to be used for great good and doesn't get used for anything but great evil now. Corruption, payoffs, under the table deals, and a lot of other things that we don't ever really get a chance to get a look at in this film. And essentially, the Riddler is explaining part of that money would have saved my life. I was an orphan. I was a person that was held down by the system, and I barely had anywhere to sleep. We were so close together in our bunks that you couldn't move your elbow left or right without bumping another child. And oh, the rats, they bit my little toes. And I was fucked over by your father. And now I have a right to destroy this entire city. And essentially, because his father died and didn't get to make good on the promises to make the city better, he suffered through a hard life and held a grudge against the Waynes and anyone else connected to that project, and decided he was going to dedicate himself to getting revenge, which is how we find ourselves towards the end of the film, where himself and Batman are having this back and forth discussion. And it crescendos with him essentially explaining, or not explaining, but assuming that Batman would have figured out his final grand plan that he left clues for within his home once he gets caught. The Batman overlooks, which personally was easy to do because the clues underneath a rug. And, as good a detective as Batman is, I feel anybody might have just not underlooked that rug, but whatever. So he explains that I'm going to flood the city. And he does. It's not a blanket threat. It's not one of those moments where you expect the villain to make this mass claim to do some destruction and the hero at the end saves the day. The hero does not save the day. He does this successfully. The explosion goes off and Gotham looks like the preset for Noah's Ark. It's just the water overtakes the entire city. Shit is just destroyed. And I like this scene, I think, the most because it gives us an opportunity to see Batman in an element that I feel better suits the Batman character. Granted, he's had other film adaptations and other, comic book versions, endless numbers, where he saves the day before things go bad. But I think there's a certain sense of appeal and getting to see this new version of Batman and how he's going to attack, trying to salvage the city instead of saving the city. So we get these variation scenes where he's trying to, lead people out of the destruction and help people out of this onslaught of this mass buildings that have fallen over and debris and just, the city's underwater and Batman's doing all that a Batman is really able to do. But a level one base level Batman that isn't just, flying helicopters out and, using mass amounts of tech. He's more so using his presence and the leadership of just showing a stern but calming, comforting sense of nature in the midst of this debacle, that he's going to make sure that we're okay. And that's pretty much where we wrap up the ending of where we leave off the Batman as a stepping off point. I think as a whole, it's probably, as compared to Batman Begins, probably my favorite up until this point of a starting off point Batman. You do a really good job framing someone who's thrown into this by choice, obviously, but thrown into it very early on. And you get the benefit of stepping inside their conscience with how they frame the structure of the film and trying to understand, how someone with not the most hindsight might be assessing situations like this, and with the grudge that he's feeling with what originally is fueling him at the start of the film, which is this redemption that he feels of standing up for his family that was cruelly taken away from him, and was trying to do all it could to better its city, and a bit more of an understanding where he's at the end of the film, that, a sense of an all that glitters is not gold sort of thing, where, no matter what person we're dealing with, or no matter what ideal it is, nothing's ever as 100% pure as we think it is. And that's okay. And it's a humanizing thing where it almost helps him understand a bit about what more he needs to do because of it, which is, I don't need to just be one linear thing. I need to have more layers to me if I'm going to try to save all of this going forward. And with that proclamation and that understanding, you really do get a chance to see him looking out going forward with a bit more perspective, and ultimately left me more enthused for what the sequel is going to be about, where this Batman will step off and what he needs to apply onto himself going forward to be the best version of this Batman that he needs to be. The initial version, we almost get a 90-10 ratio where it's all Batman and barely any Bruce Wayne. But I think by the end of this, and by unearthing more information about his family and about himself, ultimately, he gets to understand that I have to be a more fleshed out version of myself to do good for this place. And I think we'll see a more of a Bruce Wayne presence in the future, one more of the suave, debonair, playing within the movers and shakers of society of Gotham Bruce Wayne that we get, because he's going to need to be present within those rooms and at those tables to be a better Batman. He'll get more information that way. He'll be more intertwined with what's going on within the city and be able to influence it more than just, pounding his way aggressively through the pavement. Instead, he'll actually be able to apply with the mass fortune that he also was left, that he kind of overlooked within this film, to some good use. And I think that ultimately, by the time we get to the second one, this is going to be a really, really fleshed out, nice universe, and a really fleshed out, nice Batman, confined within the realm of Gotham. And I think that Robert Pattinson is going to take away what he did with this, the criticism, good and bad. And I think he's going to be in a really good place for it going forward. And I'm invested in seeing whatever the second Batman iteration is going to be. And I think it's going to ultimately work out really well. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and bring to close the somewhat introspective, semi-in-depth review of the Batman for our first episode of the Toasty Time podcast with Toasty Talks. Hoping that everyone enjoyed it. Please leave all the engaging comments you can below, and I'll make sure I'm responding to everyone. We're going to be doing reoccurring episodes in the format like this with discussions. We're actually going to have a guest moving forward, hopefully, for all the episodes going on. The next one we're going to be doing for episode 2 is going to be a review of Atlanta, the show written by Donald Glover, for episodes 1 and 2 of the new season that just premiered recently. So hopefully you guys can tune in for that, and we're going to be looking forward to it. So everybody, if you can, leave a like below, make sure you comment, and we'll see you on the next Toasty episode.